When I say 12 apostles, images of the Last Supper and scheming Judas Iscariot with his 30 pieces of silver probably come to mind. But if I was to ask you a question as simple as who are the 12 apostles, would you be able to name them? A simple list of Jesus' 12 closest disciples. Anybody who's read the Bible should be able to tell it to you, right? No. A simple list of 12 male names attributed to the apostles of Christ do not exist. And that's because the Bible itself is not super clear on who these fellows are. A couple are universal. Peter, James, John, and Judas are generally considered to be apostles by most Christians today. But besides these funkies, each gospel gives a completely different list of the 12 apostles. And because of this confusion, tons of early Christian literature describing the lives and often brutal deaths of these apostles has been written, usually wildly contradictory and confusing for early Christians while interacting with other believers who had been exposed to different stories. Additionally, the different communities equated different apostles together, which allowed them to create a nice and neat list of 12, but once again created confusion between two or more communities who often had conflicting lists. So who exactly were Jesus's closest Jewish pals? And why are they so confusing? Let's start with really the most famous of them all, Judas Iscariot. And full disclosure, we're going to be getting fully wacky and wild, so pay attention to the name and pay attention to the face and not the name on screen, because if you pay attention to the name, you will be confused. This apostle betrayed Jesus to the Romans Benedict Arnold style for 30 pieces of silver, but unfortunately for him, immediately died afterwards. Exactly how he met his violent end varies by the source. According to Matthew, often considered the oldest of the four Gospels by scholars today, Judas attempted to return the famous 30 pieces of silver to the Jewish temple, who refused on account of the violent means from which he earned it. Overcome with guilt, he then hung himself or hanged himself, whatever it is. But according to the book of Acts, Judas buys a field with his blood money and then mysteriously explodes one day, spilling his bowels out across the field. Besides Judas Iscariot, 3 people are usually considered to be the most important of the apostles, who are relatively uncontroversial between the Gospels: James, John, and Peter. James, who we'll call James the Great to make things a little simpler later on, was the eldest son of the fishing captain Zebedee, from what is today the Golan Heights area of Syria. James the Great's mother is generally considered by many traditions to be a sister of Mary, mother of Jesus, and therefore James is his first cousin. James, along with his younger brother John, are often considered the first 2 people to join Jesus' ministry after he approached them while they were getting ready to fish with their father. Jesus himself was already around 30 years old at this point, as that was his age according to the Gospel of John, when his other cousin, also named John, baptized him in the River Jordan. Peter is another fisherman apostle with a brother, however one with no relation to Jesus. Andrew, the brother of Peter, is another of the uncontroversial apostles, as all 4 Gospels mention him, so we'll quickly breeze through his story before we really get into the crazy shit. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus calls Peter, then known as Simon, and Andrew, after observing them fishing, to be fishers among men. In Luke, only Simon is mentioned as being on the boat while Jesus preached, and John, as you will soon learn, comes in and completely changes everything. In John, Andrew is a disciple of the aforementioned John the Baptist, who, after witnessing Jesus' baptism and John's message that Jesus was the Messiah, left with an unnamed man who is traditionally associated with John, brother of James, James the Great, to become Jesus' first two apostles, that being John and Andrew. Because of this story, the Eastern Orthodox Church recognizes Andrew as the quote-unquote first called. After Jesus' death, legend places Andrew all over the world. However, the most popular story of his ministry are his missionary activities in the Eastern Roman Empire, establishing what would eventually become the Patriarchate of Constantinople, before becoming a martyr by being crucified on an X-shaped cross. Now, for his brother, the story is not so simple. In John, Andrew recruits Simon to leave his family and join Jesus' ministry, which he does, and subsequently becomes one of the most important disciples, becoming Peter after receiving the name from Jesus himself, as the name in Greek means rock, and according to tradition, he was to be the rock on which Jesus' church was to be built. However, early Christians likely saw the Apostle Peter and Simon as two different people, indicating that this story may have been a later invention to combine two apostles together to create a nice even 12, and possibly revise the canon as the memory of one of these figures became lost or naturally intertwined with the other. After the death of Jesus, Peter famously created the Patriarchate of Rome, and got martyred by Nero, allegedly after the Christians of Rome were blamed for the Great Fire of 64 AD. Today, the Patriarchate of Rome is known as the Catholic Church, and is the largest single denomination of Christianity in the entire world. Now, as for James and John, the Gospel of John doesn't even name them directly, instead only mentioning sons of Zebedee, and of course, the apostle whom Jesus loved, which is often considered to be John himself, who is also attributed with authorship of this text. Legend traditionally asserts that James was executed via beheading by Herod Agrippa, the final king of Judea. After his brother's death, John, often considered to be the most important apostle by many denominations today, went to Ephesus and became one of the most important theological teachers of his time, associated then with the ministry of Paul. John is the only apostle to die of old age in Christian tradition. Okay, now all the easy ones are basically done. It's time to get crazy. Well, almost. There's still one more uncontroversial one. Philip is mentioned in all four Gospels. He was also a fisherman from the Golan, who after Jesus' death converted the wife of a Roman official who crucified him for it. However, Philip is more notable for his associations. In John, he introduces Nathanael to Jesus, who takes him on as an apostle. However, Nathanael does not appear in any of the other Gospels. Instead, a man named Bartholomew seems to take his place. Although this is unknown, as there are several apostles mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but not in John. So Nathanael could be any of the other apostles who aren't mentioned. A similar problem arises with the apostle Matthew, who in the Gospel of Matthew is called upon to spread the good word, a task that in other Gospels is ascribed to a fellow called Levi. So tradition would assert that these two are the same, even though Mark and Luke mention both Matthew and Levi. To make matters just a little bit worse, the sixth or seventh apostle, depending on which list you're reading, is generally listed as Judas, who is clearly distinguished from Judas Iscariot, the betrayer of Jesus, and only appears in the Gospels of Luke and John, except for a brief mention of Judas, a biological brother of Jesus, in the Gospel of Matthew. Additionally, an apostle named Thaddeus, who most Christians consider the same person as the Judas from Luke and John, but different from the brother of Jesus, who also, according to Matthew, had three other brothers, including James, Simon, and Joseph, which does not make anything more clear, as it's somewhat unknown whether or not the Simon that may be Peter or may not be was a brother of Jesus or not. Additionally, oh boy, I'm saying that a lot, Catholics don't see James, Simon, Joseph, and Judas, the brothers of Jesus, as actual sons of Mary, but instead cousins of Jesus, or stepbrothers of Jesus through Joseph, through Joseph having kids from a previous marriage, basically. This means that Jesus had two different cousins named James who were both followers of his ministry. And it gets so much worse, don't fucking worry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention as the ninth apostle James, a different James, a third James, James son of Alphaeus, which causes even way more issues because Matthew is said to be a son of Alphaeus, which according to Orthodox tradition means that James and Matthew were brothers. However, Catholics assert that James was the brother of Judas the Apostle, aka Thaddeus or Judas Thaddeus, since Judas is often referred to as Judas of James. And since in the Catholic tradition they don't think that the brothers of Jesus are actually biological brothers and cousins instead, that makes it so all of these figures are basically the same people in Catholic tradition. James, son of Alphaeus, and Judas of James were the sons of a woman called Mary of Alphaeus, who is a sister of the mother of Jesus, which does mean that Mary had a sister who was also named Mary. However, to Orthodox Christians, Jesus had 4 biological brothers, and James of Alphaeus was not one of them and was not directly related to Jesus at all, but instead related to the tax collector Matthew / maybe Levi, who was his brother. Got all that? Okay. In Armenian tradition, Judas Thaddeus the Apostle and Bartholomew / maybe Nathaniel went to Armenia following Jesus' death and became the first and second patriarchs of the Armenian Apostolic Church, respectively. Bartholomew, like basically everybody, as you'll see if you haven't already seen, has many stories of his brutal martyrdom. One where he's beaten unconscious and thrown into the sea, one where he's tortured to death in Armenia by a prince. I'm sure you get the idea, so I'm not going to keep doing all of these for every single apostle. It's a similar story for Judas Thaddeus, who according to Armenian tradition was executed in 66 AD and buried in what is today the West Azerbaijan province of Iran. Matthew is widely attributed with spreading the word to Ethiopia, where he was allegedly martyred while delivering a liturgy. According to Islam, he is credited with spreading the word of God to Ethiopia along with Andrew, shortly after or around the same time of James the Great's death, about 40 AD. Okay, so the observant among you will realize that technically we've probably gone over 12 already. But still, there are 2 listed in almost all of the Gospels. First is maybe the most controversial apostle of them all, Doubting Thomas, who, while mentioned in every single Gospel, does the most in John, where famously he doubts of Jesus' resurrection, only to be proven wrong. However, his greatest sin is causing me great confusion and headache. In later texts, usually Coptic, Thomas is known as Judas Thomas, Jesus Christ, and scholars are split on whether these texts reference the Thomas listed among the 12 apostles, or Judas Thaddeus listed in the 12 apostles, meaning that these 2 figures can't be the same guy. To make matters way worse, at least one surviving source claims that Thomas is the twin brother of Jesus himself, which would either point to a fifth unknown brother or that one of the four aforementioned brothers is Thomas himself, which would complicate the Catholic idea that Jesus' brothers were actually his cousins. But to be fair, this basically complicates every single Catholic idea. Either way, Thomas went to India after the death of Jesus and was martyred brutally, yada yada. Now, to put a neat little bow on an already neat little list, the final apostle, Simon. Oh, you thought we were done with this tomfoolery, didn't you? To distinguish him from Peter, he is referred to as the Zealot in the three Gospels that he's mentioned in. Zealot referring to the Judean independence political movement that was popular around the time of Jesus. So he's not Peter. But as previously stated, Peter might not be the same guy as Simon, brother of Andrew. And further still, the Simon listed as a brother of Jesus is often conflated with Simon the Zealot by Catholics, which would seemingly imply a zealot sympathetic vein running through the family of Jesus, which politically speaking makes total sense, but sort of contradicts Paul's later ministry, as he would completely shift the focus of Christianity from liberating Judea and securing peace for the Jewish people to converting Gentiles purely for theological reasons. To just make matters worse, some sources call him, you guessed it, Judas the Zealot. And in some old copies of Matthew, Judas the Zealot is listed where Judas Thaddeus should be. This seems to suggest that maybe Simon the Zealot and Judas Thaddeus were the same person, or rather that Judas and Thaddeus were not the same person, as both Simon and Thaddeus were listed in Matthew, and Simon could be referring to Judas, not Thaddeus referring to Judas. Additionally, there it is again, many are not sure how to square all these Judases with Judas, the brother of Jesus. The brothers of Jesus, especially James, have their own rich library of literature describing how their lives before and after Jesus' ministry played out. James is generally credited as the first bishop of Jerusalem and founding that city's patriarchate. His successor, Simeon of Jerusalem, is in Catholic tradition Simon, brother of Jesus, which would also mean Simon the Zealot is the second bishop of Jerusalem. After James, not the one of the two apostles who also share the name James, or maybe he is if you're Catholic, who knows, died. Okay, we're almost done. The astute among you may have already noticed something. Earlier I mentioned that Thomas couldn't be Judas Thaddeus, since they're both mentioned in Matthew. But if Judas and Thaddeus aren't the same, then Thomas and Thaddeus can be listed together with no problem. And as mentioned before, Judas the Zealot was a possible replacement for Thaddeus when translating Matthew. So, it's completely possible and believed by many that Simon the Zealot, Thomas, and Judas Thaddeus, who may or may not be Thaddeus, those might be separate people, are all the same person. Or possibly that they are all the same person as Judas, brother of Jesus. Or not all of them are the same person as Judas, brother of Jesus, but some combination of those people are the brother of Jesus. Does that make sense? So to summarize, no, I'm not going to do all that. But there's a lot more to the story that I didn't even mention, such as every single one of the many Johns, the order of the apostles, or even little Matthias. I didn't even talk about him. There's way more I can do. So if this gets any views, I might do a second one.